e4 e5. This is the standard opening of the game, known as the open game, where both players advance their central pawns to control the center. Qf3 and f6. White brings out the queen early to f3, which is an unusual move as it blocks the development of the knight on b1. Black responds by developing their knight to f6, contesting the center and preparing for kingside castling. bc4 d6. White develops the bishop to c4, putting pressure on the f7 square. Black responds by developing their d7 pawn to d6, reinforcing the e5 pawn and freeing the bishop on c8. nc3 b6. White develops the knight to c3, aiming to control the center. Black responds by offering a trade of bishops and simultaneously attacking White's central e4 pawn. b6 f6. White captures the bishop on e6 with their queen, doubling Black's pawns on the f-file but gaining control over the center. Black recaptures with the f-pawn, maintaining a strong central presence. d3 nc6. White reinforces the e4 pawn with the d3 pawn and prepares to develop the knight to f3. Black develops their knight to c6, preparing to put more pressure on White's central pawns. bg5 nd4. White moves the bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6. Black counterattacks by moving their knight to d4, attacking the pinned bishop and threatening to win the exchange. qd1 h6. White retreats the queen to d1, breaking the pin on the knight. Black advances their h-pawn to h6, forcing the bishop to make a decision about where to retreat. bxf6 qxf6. White exchanges bishops on f6, doubling Black's pawns again but opening up the f-file for the rook. Black recaptures with the queen, maintaining central control and preparing to connect the rooks. nge2 next 2. White develops the knight to e2, freeing the f1 square for the rook and clearing the d4 square for the queen. Black captures the knight with their knight on e2, simplifying the position. c2000. White castles kingside, bringing the king to safety and connecting the rooks. Black castles queenside, also bringing the king to safety and preparing to activate the rook on the d8 square. ookb8. White moves the king's rook to d1, placing it on an open file and preparing to potentially double rooks. Black moves their king's bishop to b8, improving its position and potentially preparing to put pressure on the a-file. nb5 a6. White advances the knight to b5, attacking the c7 pawn and potentially preparing to fork the queen and rook. Black pushes their a-pawn to a6, defending the b5 square and potentially preparing to open the a-file. nc3 d5. White retreats the knight to c3, maintaining pressure on the center. Black advances their d-pawn to d5, striking at the center and opening lines for their pieces. b3 d4. White advances the b-pawn to b3, potentially preparing to fianchetto the bishop on b2. Black advances their d-pawn to d4, further advancing their central pawns and gaining space. na4 g5. White retreats the knight to a4, potentially preparing to reroute it to a more active square. Black advances their g-pawn to g5, gaining space on the kingside and potentially preparing a pawn storm. c3 h5. White advances the c-pawn to c3, aiming to open lines and gain counterplay. Black advances their h-pawn to h5, further advancing their kingside pawn storm and potentially preparing to open lines against White's king. c4 g4. White advances the c-pawn to c4, gaining space and potentially preparing to open lines against Black's king. Black advances their g-pawn to g4, continuing their kingside pawn storm and potentially preparing to open lines against White's king. g3 h4. White advances the g-pawn to g3, closing the kingside and potentially preparing to create a safe haven for the king. Qxg4 hxg3, white captures the g4 pawn with the queen, but black counterattacks by capturing the h3 pawn with their h-pawn, opening lines against white's king. Fxg3 qh6, white captures the h3 pawn with their f-pawn, but black continues their attack by threatening checkmate with the queen on h2. H4 qe3+, white blocks the check with h4, but black continues to apply pressure by checking with their queen on e3, threatening to win the f2 pawn and potentially deliver checkmate. Kg2 qxd3, white moves their king to g2, escaping the check and potentially preparing to counterattack. Black captures the pawn on d3 with their queen, opening lines against white's king and threatening to win material. Xe6 xe4+, white captures the e6 pawn with their queen, but black delivers another check with their queen on e4, continuing to apply pressure and potentially winning material. Kh3 d3, white moves their king to h3, escaping the check and potentially preparing to counterattack. Black advances their d-pawn to d3, further advancing their central pawns and potentially preparing to promote. Nc3 qe3, white moves the knight to c3, attacking the queen and potentially preparing to reroute to a more active square. Black moves their queen back to e3, maintaining pressure on white's position and preparing to support the d3 pawn. Qf6 bd6, white advances their queen to f6, attacking the bishop on d6 and potentially preparing to create threats against black's king. Black moves their bishop to d6, reinforcing their kingside defense and potentially preparing to reroute the bishop to a more active square. Nd5 qd4, white advances the knight to d5, attacking the queen and potentially preparing to create threats against black's king. Black moves their queen to d4, maintaining pressure on white's position and potentially preparing to create threats against white's king. Rfd1 rdf8, white moves their rook to fd1, potentially preparing to double rooks on the d-file and create threats against black's king. Black moves their rook to f8, reinforcing their control of the f-file and preparing to create threats against white's king. Qg7 rxh4+, white advances their queen to g7, potentially creating threats against black's king. Black delivers a powerful sacrifice with their rook on h4, sacrificing it to open lines against white's king and create threats. Gxh4 rf3+, white captures the rook on h4 with their g-pawn, but black sacrifices their rook on f3 with a check. This move aims to open lines and create threats against white's king, as the king is now exposed on the g2 square. Kg2 qf2+, white moves their king to g2, attempting to escape the check. However, black continues their attack by delivering a powerful check with their queen on f2. The queen now threatens mate on h2, and the king has limited escape squares. Kh1 rh3, white moves their king to h1, but black delivers a decisive checkmate with their rook on h3. With the support of the queen on f2 and the h-pawn on h4, the rook on h3 delivers mate, as the king has no legal moves,